It is now as easy, because of the communications revolution, it is as easy for a British businessman to sell his product in Auckland as to sell his product in the other side of the United Kingdom. It's much easier for him to deal here than to deal with countries in Europe which don't share his language, his common law system, his accountancy rules, his legal norms, and so on. So that I don't see the Anglosphere as a sort of nostalgic thing or a sentimental past thing. I see it very much as a logical response to changing technology and to a different and smaller world. Yeah.
So why did David Cameron opt out or decline to hold a referendum, having promised to do one? Was it just, well, we can have a referendum, we can vote against it, but what happens anyway?
I mean, you'd have to ask him the question. My guess is that he simply doesn't want to be distracted from the enormous deficit problem that we have. You won't be surprised if I tell you that I've discussed this with him in frank terms, and I completely accept his goodwill. He did try and get a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty. There was, you will often. You'll read some journalists saying, "Oh, he was secretly relieved when the Irish reversed their no vote, and he was, he had his fingers crossed behind his back when he said he won." I know for a fact that that isn't the case. But where he is now, as he sees it, he doesn't want to open another front on Europe when there is this huge issue of investing all your political capital in trying to bring down public spending. Now, where I disagree with that is, this is just me speaking as a backbencher. First of all, while we're doing all this deficit reduction, what's the foreign secretary going to be doing? He's got to do something to get him out of the office, and one of the ways in which he could usefully contribute to the deficit reduction would be to do something about this £12 billion a year that we're handing away in this single item of contributions to the EU budget. My party's finance spokesman, our shadow chancellor, at the most recent party conference, set out savings that he was going to make through a series of, there was going to be a pay freeze in the civil service, there was going to be the abolition of these baby bonds and so on. His savings altogether were going to save £7 billion a year across the whole of government spending. And we're spending £12 billion on this one item of contributions to the EU budget. So I don't see how you can avoid this. But the bigger issue really in a way is this. The reason why governments keep growing, the reason why budgets always expand globally is because budgets are set by members of the executive who benefit from higher spending rather than being set by members of the legislature who are champions of the taxpayers. And that's why there has to be a structural change. There are things that we could do domestically, which would be an enormous benefit in terms of spending less, such as making all the quangos and all the government departments subject to the respective parliamentary committee for to authorise their budgets. But none of that is possible as long as 84% of our laws are passed in Brussels by people that nobody gets a chance to vote for. That's the basic problem.
His whole argument doesn't hold water, does it? Distraction, quote unquote, distraction for whom, and how much of a distraction?
Well, I mean, it holds water to the extent that I suspect he's going to win the election. So he will have a mandate then to concentrate on things other than the EU. Right? And I very much hope he will win the election. I mean, he will be a million times better than the other guy.
But
and
going into the election being in favour of a referendum would not be a vote losing.
No, I think my own view, our lead, having held fairly firm at kind of 15 to 20%, suddenly come down into single figures. I think as a direct and immediate response to the cancellation of the referendum. Yeah.
Alexander Bukowski has made a series of sketches around England comparing the European Union to the old Soviet Union, which I've watched a lot of his speeches, but I'd like your view on what effect he's claiming.
You have to be very careful with, right? The European Union doesn't take away people's passports. It doesn't put us into gulags. I'll tell you, but where you can draw a limited parallel in this sense. I remember travelling in Eastern Europe in the 80s and thinking, nobody believes in this. Nobody, even the people running it, do not believe, if ever they did, in Marxism-Leninism. But they understand that their place in society and their income and their livelihood depends on the maintenance of the status quo. And that was what was holding it there. Now, I think we are in a similar situation to that since these no votes in Europe. Right? Up until the Prague Spring, up until 1968, there were people in the Soviet bloc who genuinely were committed communist idealists and who saw the suspension of democracy as contingent, and who said, well, once people see that socialism works, that not only is it a more just system than capitalism, but it's a more efficient one, and once they see that our economies are outperforming the decadent West, then we can move towards a phased restoration of parliamentary rule because people will choose to vote for the Communist Party. Right? Nobody believed that after 1968. That blew that argument out of the water. And I think the 2004-2005 process of this constitution had an equivalent impact on the Eurocrats. After 1968, in the Eastern Bloc, the leaders stopped trying to convince people. They just asked for their obedience. They asked for their consent rather than their conviction, for their acquiescence rather than their approval. It's a similar thing in Brussels now. The system is mainly there as a mechanism to employ its own employees. And that's what makes it so difficult to remove. I discovered this when I first got there. If I stand up in the European Parliament and say we should devolve this or that power or return it to the nation states, by a curious process of alchemy in the Brussels air, those words enter everyone's ear as, here's a lunatic trying to take my job away. And that makes them incredibly tenacious, because it is not then for them an issue of democracy or something, it's an issue of mortgages and school fees. And that's, so to that extent, I would draw the parallel that it is a system that lacks popular consent and that is always prepared to elevate its own ideology as a higher goal than the verdict of the ballot box or indeed its own rule book. What worries me is that governments are attempting to get rid of their own debt, or at least ours is, by printing money. And they've done this classic thing of changing the vocabulary so that you don't realize what they're doing. They call it quantitative easing. And quantitative easing literally just means printing more banknotes. But they think that by giving it a fancy name, we'll then think, oh, the experts know what they're doing, right? And I remember I wrote something about this, saying, we are collapsing. We're going to, have, on top of everything else, we're going to have hyperinflation now as a result of this. And it attracted the approving attention of a pro-Mugabe newspaper in Zimbabwe, which then said, look, you see, the Brits are doing exactly what we're doing. But actually, they've got a much worse problem than us, because they're having to do it without facing the sanctions of a united world against them, whereas we're dealing with a blockade and we're having... And I thought, of all the humiliations that Gordon Brown has inflicted on my country, to have Zimbabweans shaking their head in pity over his economic mismanagement is really a new low for us. But I think there is a real danger now that governments are, as happened in the 70s, every generation seems to have to learn this lesson anew. On top of the debt, we're going to have inflation and stagnation, and it always ends the same way. Funnily enough, the thing that is keeping Britain's credit rating up, the thing that is keeping us afloat in the eyes of the world, is the opinion polls. People know that within a few months there will be a different government in Britain, and that government will begin on a series of retrenchments. I think this is probably much more of an issue in Britain than in New Zealand, but the pattern for us has tended to be that the left gets in and spends a great deal and borrows a great deal, and then people think, oh, God, we've had a bit of a party, we need a bit of a hangover cure, and they send for the Conservatives when everything has been spent. And the Conservatives then have sort of, gradually have to bring order and sanity back to our public finances, at which point people say, good, job done, let's enjoy ourselves again. We can afford now to have a party that will be a little bit nicer. And so you have this bizarre seesaw where, rather annoyingly, we always end up taking over at the worst possible time, because we're taking over from people who have done the opposite. But no, it's not dissimilar to what happened in 1979 when Margaret Thatcher took over. The previous government then had also emptied our treasury and exhausted our credit, had to go to the IMF for a bailout.